Hello everyone, I'm the storyteller, and I'm here to guide you through another tale of mystery and suspense. I know many of you listen to these stories to unwind or fall asleep, so before we begin, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know in the comments where you're from and what time it is as you're watching this. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let the story unfold. Eleanor had inherited her grandmother's house. It was a sprawling, old Victorian estate that sat at the edge of a dense forest, miles away from the nearest town. The house had a cold, eerie charm, with its intricate woodwork, creaky floors, and tall, narrow windows that seemed to whisper in the wind. Eleanor had visited many times as a child, but she had forgotten just how unsettling it felt. Now that the house was hers, she had planned to stay for a few weeks to sort through her grandmother's belongings and decide what to do with the property. Her first night there, however, was filled with strange noises, thumping, creaking, and faint rustling coming from the attic. At first, Eleanor thought it was just the house settling. After all, it was over 100 years old. But as the night wore on, the noises grew louder and more persistent. They seemed to follow her, starting from the attic and moving slowly toward her room. By midnight, she couldn't ignore it anymore. Armed with a flashlight, Eleanor made her way through the dark, dusty hallways toward the attic door. The house groaned under her footsteps, as if protesting her presence. The door to the attic was locked, but she found the key in a nearby drawer, exactly where she remembered it. The attic stairs creaked as she ascended. Dust floated through the air, illuminated by the beam of her flashlight. The space was cluttered with old furniture, forgotten trunks, and childhood memories that had long since faded. But there was nothing out of the ordinary. No signs of movement or disturbance. She convinced herself that it had been her imagination. Maybe a raccoon or some other animal had found its way inside. Satisfied, Eleanor returned to her room and went to bed. The following night, the noises returned, louder and closer than before. This time, they weren't just thumps or creaks, it sounded like faint footsteps. Eleanor's heart raced as she listened, frozen in her bed. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and seemed to be coming from just outside her door. She grabbed her flashlight again, this time trembling as she approached the door. She opened it slowly, shining the light into the hallway. It was empty, but the air felt thick with an invisible presence. Determined to find an explanation, she made her way back to the attic. This time, something was different. As she reached the top of the stairs, she saw it, a large wooden wardrobe, which she hadn't noticed before. It was shoved against the far wall, its doors slightly ajar. Eleanor's skin prickled with unease. She approached the wardrobe cautiously, her flashlight shaking in her hand. When she opened the doors fully, she found nothing but darkness inside. No old coats or forgotten trinkets, just an empty void that seemed to swallow the light. But as she turned to leave, something cold brushed against her neck. She spun around, her breath caught in her throat. No one was there. Eleanor fled the attic, locking the door behind her. But the noises persisted, growing more sinister with each passing night. The footsteps were no longer confined to the attic. They followed her throughout the house, always just out of sight. Sometimes she would catch a glimpse of a shadow at the edge of her vision, but when she turned, there was nothing. She began to feel as though she was being watched, constantly. The sensation was inescapable, even during the day. The windows, the mirrors, every reflective surface seemed to hide unseen eyes. Her sleep was plagued with nightmares of a dark figure standing over her bed, watching her with eyes that gleamed in the darkness. Desperate for answers, Eleanor searched through her grandmother's old journals, hoping to find some explanation. In one of the final entries, she found something chilling. "The Watcher has returned. I thought I'd rid this house of it years ago, but it's found its way back. It stays in the attic during the day, but at night, it watches. Always watching. I can't escape it. I'm too old to fight it again. May whoever inherits this place have the strength I no longer possess." Eleanor's blood ran cold as she realized her grandmother had known about the presence in the house. The Watcher, whatever it was, had been lurking in the attic for years, biding its time. And now it had set its sights on her. She couldn't stay any longer. She packed her bags and left the house that night, never looking back. But even miles away, as she drove through the dark, empty roads, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she was still being watched. The Watcher, it seemed, had followed her. Deep in the heart of the Black Hollow Woods, there was a legend. The townsfolk called it the Whispering Forest, a place where the trees themselves were said to speak. Some said it was haunted, others believed it was cursed. But everyone agreed on one thing. Those who ventured too far into the forest never came back the same. Lily had heard the stories her whole life, but she never believed them. She was a skeptic, the kind of person who needed to see something to believe it. So, when she inherited a small cabin on the outskirts of Black Hollow from her estranged uncle, she didn't hesitate to move in, despite the warnings from the locals. "It's not safe out there," an old man at the general store had told her on her first day. Strange things happen in those woods. But Lily had simply smiled and shrugged it off. She didn't believe in ghosts or curses. She was here to fix up the cabin, enjoy some peace and quiet, and maybe do some hiking. The dense forest that surrounded her new home didn't frighten her. If anything, it intrigued her. Her first few days in the cabin were uneventful. The house was in decent shape, though it needed some cleaning and repairs. The forest, though thick and ominous, was beautiful in its own way. During the day, the sun filtered through the towering trees, casting long shadows on the ground. At night, the woods were silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. But on the third night, everything changed. It started with a whisper. Lily had been lying in bed, just on the edge of sleep, when she heard it. A faint, barely audible voice, like someone murmuring just outside her window. She sat up, her heart pounding in her chest. She listened, straining her ears, but all she could hear was the soft rustling of leaves in the night breeze. She tried to convince herself it was nothing. The wind, maybe, or her imagination. But the next night, it happened again. This time, the whisper was clearer. A voice, soft and eerie, calling her name. Lily. She jumped out of bed and ran to the window, but there was no one there. The forest outside was still, bathed in pale moonlight. The voice had sounded so close, as if someone had been standing just inches away from her. The following day, she searched the woods around the cabin, looking for any sign of a prankster or intruder, but she found nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, no sign that anyone had been near the house. That night, the whispering grew louder. "Lily, come to us." The voice was insistent, beckoning her to leave the safety of her home and venture into the woods. She locked her doors and windows, trying to block out the sound, but It seeped into her mind like a poison. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't ignore it. By the fourth night, Lily was at her wit's end. The whispers were constant now, filling the air around her, even during the day. They were coming from the forest, calling her, drawing her in. She could feel a strange pull, an urge to follow the voices, even though every instinct told her to stay away. The next morning, determined to find the source of the whispers, she packed a bag and ventured into the forest. The deeper she went, the quieter the world became. The wind died down, the birds stopped singing, and even the rustling of the leaves ceased. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, and then the whispering began again. "Lily, we're waiting." The voice seemed to come from all around her, echoing through the trees. She tried to follow it, her heart racing, her hands trembling. The deeper she went, the darker the forest became. The trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining above her, blocking out the sunlight. As she walked, she started to notice strange things. The trees. They weren't just whispering, they were watching her. Their gnarled, twisted branches seemed to reach out toward her, their bark etched with what looked like faces, hollow eyes and gaping mouths frozen in silent screams. Panic gripped her, but the voice was relentless. "Come closer. We've been waiting for you." Lily's breath quickened as she realized she had lost her way. The trail had vanished, and the forest around her had grown impossibly dense. She turned in every direction, but the trees looked the same, their grotesque faces seeming to shift and change, always watching her. Desperate, she ran. She didn't know where she was going, but she had to get out. She could feel the trees closing in around her, their branches scraping against her skin, their roots tangling at her feet. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, filling her mind with a deafening roar. "Stay with us. You belong here." Suddenly, she stumbled into a small clearing. In the center stood a massive tree, its bark blackened and twisted. Its branches stretched high into the sky, but it was the base of the tree that caught her attention. There, embedded in the roots, were bones, hundreds of them. Human remains, tangled in the roots like the forest had swallowed them whole. Lily backed away, her heart pounding in her ears. She had to get out of here. But before she could move, she felt something cold wrap around her ankle. She looked down to see a thin, gnarled root snaking up her leg, tightening its grip. The whispering was all around her now, louder than ever. "Stay with us. Forever." With a final, terrified scream, Lily was pulled into the earth, the forest swallowing her just as it had so many before her. Days later, when the locals went searching for her, all they found was her abandoned cabin and a single, solitary tree standing in a small clearing. The whispers, it seemed, had found their next victim. When Eric and his wife, Claire, moved into their new house, it felt like a dream come true. It was a modest home in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the perfect place to raise their young daughter, Emily. The street was lined with tall trees, and the neighbors were friendly enough. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. But there was one thing that unsettled Eric: the house next door. It was an old, dilapidated structure, its paint chipped and windows covered in grime. The yard was overgrown, with weeds pushing through cracked concrete and ivy creeping up the walls. No one seemed to live there, yet Eric often noticed lights flickering on and off at odd hours of the night. He rarely saw anyone go in or out, and the place gave off an eerie, abandoned vibe. Maybe it's just a rental, Claire suggested when Eric mentioned it one evening. Or someone who travels a lot. Eric nodded, but something about the house didn't sit right with him. It was about a week after they moved in that strange things started happening. One night, as Eric was locking up the house before bed, he glanced out of the window and saw a figure standing in the neighbor's front yard. It was dark, and the figure was shrouded in shadow, but it was unmistakably a person. They were standing perfectly still, facing Eric's house. Eric's heart skipped a beat. He blinked, and when he looked again, the figure was gone. Shaking it off as his imagination, he went to bed without mentioning it to Claire. But the next night, the same thing happened. He saw the figure again, standing in the exact same spot, watching his house. This time, he didn't just brush it off. He hurried outside, determined to confront whoever it was. But when he stepped onto his front porch, the yard was empty. No one was there. The silence of the night pressed in on him, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind. He decided not to tell Claire. She was already stressed with the move, and he didn't want to add to her worries. But the next morning, Emily said something that chilled him to the core. "Daddy," she asked at breakfast, "who's the man that stands in the window at night?" Eric's fork clattered onto his plate. "What man, sweetie?" Emily pointed to the house next door. "The man in that house. He watches us from the window." Eric exchanged a concerned look with Claire, who frowned and shook her head. "There's no one living in that house, honey." "Yes, there is," Emily insisted. "He's always there at night, looking at me." Eric's skin prickled with unease, but he tried to remain calm. "Well, if you see him again, let us know, okay?" Emily nodded and went back to her cereal, but Eric couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That evening, as soon as Emily was asleep, he decided to investigate the house next door. He grabbed a flashlight and headed outside. The old, creaky gate groaned as he pushed it open, and the yard was even more overgrown than it looked from his own window. Weeds brushed against his legs, and the smell of damp earth filled the air. As he approached the house, he noticed that the windows were covered in a thick layer of dust and grime, making it impossible to see inside. He walked up to the front door and knocked, just to be sure. No answer. He tried the door, but it was locked. Undeterred, he walked around the side of the house, looking for another way in. When he reached the back, he found a small window that was slightly ajar. He hesitated for a moment, then pushed it open and climbed inside. The air inside the house was stale and musty, and the wooden floor creaked under his weight. The interior was a mess. Old furniture covered in dust, cobwebs hanging from the ceiling, and an overwhelming sense of neglect. It looked as though no one had lived there for years. But something felt wrong. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, as if the house itself was alive and watching him. He moved through the rooms cautiously, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The place was empty, just as he had expected, but the atmosphere was heavy with a sinister presence. As he made his way upstairs, he noticed something odd. One of the doors at the end of the hallway was slightly open, and there was a faint glow coming from inside. His pulse quickened. Slowly, he approached the door and pushed it open. The room was small, with a single chair facing the window. And in that chair sat a figure. Eric froze. The figure was turned away from him, facing the window that overlooked his own house. It was perfectly still, as if it hadn't noticed him enter. "Hello?" Eric's voice was barely above a whisper. No response. He took a cautious step closer. The figure remained motionless. His heart pounded in his chest as he reached out, his hand trembling, and placed it on the figure's shoulder. The figure slumped forward, lifeless. Eric stumbled back in horror as the chair tipped over, revealing the figure's face. It was a mannequin, a grotesque, human-like doll, its face twisted into a macabre smile. Its eyes were hollow, but they seemed to be staring directly at Eric, as if mocking him. Suddenly, a whisper filled the room. "Get out." Eric's blood ran cold. The voice wasn't coming from the mannequin. It was coming from the walls, the floor, the air itself. "Get out." He didn't need to be told twice. He bolted out of the room, down the stairs, and out of the house, not stopping until he was safely back inside his own home. His heart was racing, and his mind was spinning with questions. What had he just seen? Why was that mannequin there, and who, or what, had whispered those words? That night, as Eric lay in bed, he couldn't sleep. Every creak, every rustle of the wind made him jump. And then, just before dawn, he heard it again. A knock at the door. Not his front door, the door next door. Eric peeked out of the window, his breath catching in his throat. There, standing on the porch of the old house, was a figure. The same figure he had seen standing in the yard. It slowly turned and looked directly at him, its face obscured by the shadows. And then, without a sound, it vanished into the darkness. The next morning, Eric called a real estate agent. He and Claire put the house up for sale and moved out within a week. No one ever moved into the house next door. And, as far as Eric knew, it still stood there, silent and waiting. Its unseen occupant watching. Jacob had always been fascinated by old buildings. There was something about their crumbling facades and forgotten histories that captivated him. So, when he found out that an ancient hotel, once the grandest in the city, was being auctioned off, he couldn't resist the opportunity. The Crescent Pines Hotel had been closed for decades, abandoned to time, but its legacy lingered in whispers. Some said it was cursed, others believed it was haunted. But Jacob didn't care about superstitions. To him, it was a passion project, a chance to restore something magnificent. The hotel sat on the edge of a dense forest, its once pristine walls now overgrown with vines, its windows boarded up, and its sign barely visible through the grime. Inside, it was even worse. Dust covered every surface, cobwebs hung like forgotten decorations, and the air was thick with the smell of decay. But Jacob could see beyond the ruin. He could picture its grand halls bustling with guests again, its ballroom filled with laughter and music. After months of preparation, he finally began the renovation. He hired a small crew to help clean out the debris, but strange things started happening almost immediately. Tools would go missing, only to be found in places no one remembered leaving them. Doors that had been locked would be found wide open, and sometimes the sound of footsteps echoed through the empty halls when no one else was inside. The workers were spooked, and by the third week, half of the crew had quit. Jacob tried to stay calm, dismissing the strange occurrences as accidents or nervous imaginations. He had heard stories of haunted hotels before, but he didn't believe in ghosts. This was just an old building. It creaked and groaned as all old places did. But then, one night, something happened that he couldn't ignore. Jacob had stayed late to go over blueprints. He sat at a small desk in the lobby, the only light coming from the dim lamp he had brought with him. The hotel was eerily silent, the wind outside rustling through the trees. Just as he was about to pack up and leave, he heard it. Footsteps. They were soft at first, barely audible, but they grew louder, more deliberate, as if someone was walking toward him. Jacob froze, listening. The footsteps were coming from the grand staircase at the far end of the lobby. Slowly, he turned his head, shining his flashlight toward the stairs. No one was there. But the footsteps continued, growing louder, descending the stairs one by one. His heart pounded in his chest as he stood up, scanning the empty room. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing through the vast lobby. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, slowly, a figure appeared at the top of the stairs. It was a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned gown, her hair pinned up in a style that hadn't been worn in decades. She was pale, her features indistinct in the low light, but Jacob could tell something was wrong. Her eyes were dark, hollow, and she didn't seem to be walking, more like gliding down the steps. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to move, to run, but his feet were rooted to the spot. The woman continued her slow descent, her gaze fixed on him. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she stopped and tilted her head, as if studying him. For what felt like an eternity, neither of them moved. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Have you come to stay?" Jacob blinked, his mind racing. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the woman turned and vanished into the shadows, as if she had never been there. Shaken, Jacob quickly gathered his things and left the hotel. The encounter haunted him, but he convinced himself that it had been a trick of the light, his tired mind playing games with him. He returned the next day, determined to finish what he had started. But the strange occurrences continued. Every night, he heard the same footsteps, and every night, he saw the same woman. She never approached him again, but she always appeared, watching him from the shadows, as if waiting for something. One night, after weeks of sleepless nights and frayed nerves, Jacob decided to do some research on the hotel's history. He spent hours in the local library, sifting through old newspapers and records. And that's when he discovered something chilling. The Crescent Pines Hotel had been the site of a tragic event over 50 years ago. A young woman named Lillian Prescott had been a guest at the hotel on the night of its grand reopening after extensive renovations. She was a well-known socialite, the belle of every ball. But on the night of the reopening, she had mysteriously disappeared. No one ever saw her leave the hotel, and despite extensive searches, her body was never found. Rumors swirled about what had happened to her. Some believed she had been murdered. Others thought she had run away. But the truth was never uncovered. Over time, the hotel's reputation suffered, and not long after, it closed its doors for good. As Jacob read through the articles, a cold realization washed over him. The woman he had been seeing, the one who glided down the stairs night after night, she was Lillian. Determined to find answers, Jacob returned to the hotel late one evening. Armed with a camera and a tape recorder, he ventured into the lobby, standing at the base of the grand staircase where he had first seen her. He called out her name, his voice shaky but firm. "Lillian Prescott, are you here?" For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then the air grew cold. A soft, almost mournful whisper filled the room. "Why did you come back?" Jacob's heart pounded in his chest as the woman appeared at the top of the stairs once more. but this time something was different. Her pale face was twisted in sorrow, her dark eyes filled with pain. She descended the stairs, her movements slow and deliberate. When she reached the bottom, she didn't stop. She walked toward him, her hand outstretched. "Help me," she whispered. Before Jacob could react, she vanished, leaving behind a suffocating silence. His camera had captured nothing but static, and his tape recorder played back only the sound of his own breathing. Over the following days, Jacob became obsessed with finding out what had happened to Lillian. He searched the hotel from top to bottom, convinced that the answer was hidden somewhere within its walls. And then, one afternoon, in the basement, he found it. Behind a crumbling wall, Jacob uncovered a hidden room. Inside was an old, decaying trunk. When he opened it, the stench of death filled the air. Lying at the bottom of the trunk were the remains of a woman, her bones brittle and covered in dust. Clutched in her skeletal hand was a locket with the initials L.P., Lillian Prescott. Jacob's breath caught in his throat as the pieces fell into place. She hadn't disappeared. She had been murdered and hidden away, her spirit trapped in the hotel, waiting for someone to uncover the truth. That night, as he stood in the lobby one last time, Jacob felt a presence beside him. He turned to see Lillian, her face no longer twisted in sorrow, but peaceful. She smiled softly, and for the first time her voice was clear. "Thank you." And then she was gone. The Crescent Pines Hotel was finally at peace. But Jacob, now haunted by what he had uncovered, decided it was a place best left forgotten. At the edge of the small town of Willow Creek stood a house everyone avoided. It was old, crumbling, and surrounded by a thick tangle of trees that seemed to choke the life out of it. The locals called it the doll-maker's house. Decades ago, an old man named Mr. Abernathy had lived there. He was a reclusive craftsman known for creating lifelike dolls, each one a perfect, eerie replica of a real person. Some said he had made dolls for kings and queens, while others whispered darker rumors, that his dolls were somehow cursed, or worse, that they weren't just dolls at all. When Mr. Abernathy vanished without a trace, the house was left to rot. No one dared go inside, not even teenagers looking for a thrill. But for Amelia, a young woman new to Willow Creek, the house was irresistible. Amelia had always been fascinated by old things, especially antiques with history and mystery behind them. When she first heard the stories about the doll-maker's house, she was intrigued. She didn't believe in ghosts or curses, and the thought of exploring the place excited her more than it scared her. She had moved to Willow Creek for a quieter life after years of working in a busy city, but she hadn't expected it to be this quiet. The house offered her a bit of adventure. One overcast afternoon, curiosity got the best of her. Armed with a flashlight and a camera, she made her way down the overgrown path that led to the doll-maker's house. The air grew colder as she approached, and the trees seemed to lean in as if trying to keep her away. The front door creaked open with little effort. Inside, the house was just as she had imagined. Dusty, with faded wallpaper peeling off the walls and broken furniture scattered across the floor. But what caught her attention immediately were the dolls. Dozens of them lined the shelves, sat in chairs, or leaned against the walls. Each one was unsettlingly lifelike, their glass eyes seeming to follow her as she moved through the rooms. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothes, their expressions frozen in time. Some looked sad, others surprised, and a few had blank, hollow stares that made her uneasy. Amelia tried to shake off the feeling that she was being watched. She had come here for an adventure, after all, and she wasn't going to let a few creepy dolls scare her off. She wandered through the house, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of something rotten lingered in the corners. As she explored, she noticed that every room had more dolls, some sitting in rocking chairs, others propped up on shelves, all of them staring at her with their unnervingly real eyes. In the parlor, she found a workbench covered in tools and scraps of fabric, as if the old doll maker had been interrupted mid-creation. There was even an unfinished doll lying on the table, its face half-formed, its body a bare skeleton of wood and cloth. But the strangest part was a large cabinet in the corner of the room. It was padlocked, the metal rusted with age. Something about it drew her in. Why would someone lock away dolls? What could be so dangerous or valuable about them? Amelia's heart raced with excitement. She wanted to know what was inside, but she had no way of opening the lock. She decided to leave and return the next day with tools to break it open. As she turned to leave, she heard it, a soft creak behind her, like the sound of wood bending. She froze, her flashlight trembling in her hand. Slowly, she turned back to the room. The unfinished doll on the workbench hadn't moved, but she could have sworn its position was different. It was closer to the edge now, as if it had shifted ever so slightly. Amelia swallowed hard, her mouth dry. "It's just the wind," she whispered to herself. "Just an old house settling." She hurried out of the room, her nerves beginning to fray. The house seemed darker now, the air heavier. As she made her way to the front door, the feeling that she was being watched grew stronger. The dolls. Their eyes seemed to track her every movement, their frozen faces twisted in unnatural ways. Amelia didn't look back. She stepped outside, gasping for the fresh air. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the trees. The house loomed behind her, silent and still, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something inside was watching her. That night, Amelia lay awake in bed, her thoughts racing. She couldn't stop thinking about the dolls, especially the locked cabinet. What was in there? Why had Mr. Abernathy left it locked away? And why did the dolls seem so alive? Determined to find out, she returned the next day with a crowbar. The house was just as she had left it, the air inside cold and musty. She made her way back to the parlor where the locked cabinet stood waiting. It took her several tries, but eventually the old lock gave way with a sharp snap. She pulled the cabinet doors open, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside were more dolls, but these were different. They were much older, their faces more worn, their clothes tattered. But it wasn't their age that startled her. It was their eyes. Unlike the other dolls in the house, these had eyes that looked disturbingly human. They weren't made of glass, but something far more organic. Amelia stepped back, her stomach churning. What had Mr. Abernathy done? Had he used real human parts in his creations? The thought made her skin crawl. Before she could process what she was seeing, she heard it again. A creak, this time louder. She turned just in time to see one of the dolls from the shelf slowly, impossibly, turn its head toward her. Her blood ran cold. The doll blinked. Amelia stumbled backward, her hands shaking. The other dolls, one by one, began to move. Some blinked, others shifted in their seats, and a few began to stand, their limbs creaking with the sound of old wood and stiff joints. No, Amelia whispered, backing toward the door. "This isn't real." But it was real. The dolls were moving. They were watching her. And as she reached the doorway, she heard a voice, soft and eerie, like a child's whisper. "Stay with us." Amelia turned and ran. She didn't stop until she was outside, panting and covered in cold sweat. The house stood silent behind her, but she knew what she had seen. The dolls, they were alive. They had been watching her all along. She didn't go back to the doll-maker's house after that. The thought of those lifelike eyes and moving limbs haunted her every waking moment. She tried to tell herself it had all been in her head, that the isolation and the eerie atmosphere had played tricks on her mind. But deep down, she knew the truth. The dolls were waiting, and she wasn't the only one they had watched. In a forgotten part of the countryside, shrouded by thick fog and towering trees, stood Blackwood Manor. The grand estate had once been a symbol of wealth and prosperity, but after the tragic death of its last owner, it fell into disrepair. Locals claimed the manor was haunted, cursed by the sorrow of its past, and they spoke of strange sounds and flickering lights that could be seen at night. Most avoided the manor, but for Jenna, a young journalist eager to make her mark, it was the perfect story. Jenna arrived at the manor just as twilight settled over the land. The massive structure loomed ahead, its windows dark like hollow eyes. She parked her car on the gravel path and stepped out, a chill creeping through the air. With her camera and notepad in hand, she approached the heavy oak door, which creaked open as if inviting her inside. The interior was dark and musty, filled with the scent of mildew and decay. Dust motes danced in the faint light that filtered through the broken windows. Jenna's heart raced with a mix of excitement and trepidation as she stepped into the grand foyer, where a staircase spiraled into the darkness above. Taking a deep breath, Jenna began her exploration. She wandered through the ground floor, snapping photos of the remnants of a once lavish lifestyle. Ornate furniture draped in white sheets, portraits of stern-faced ancestors lining the walls, and a grand piano that sat silent in the corner. Each room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for someone to uncover its secrets. As she made her way to the kitchen, Jenna couldn't shake the feeling that she was not alone. A soft whisper echoed through the halls, barely audible but persistent. She paused, straining to hear, but the sound faded. Shaking her head, she brushed it off as the wind. After exploring for an hour, Jenna decided to set up her equipment in the drawing room. She wanted to capture the eerie ambience of the manor and perhaps catch a glimpse of the rumored ghosts. As she arranged her camera, she felt a sudden drop in temperature. Her breath came out in small puffs of fog, and a shiver ran down her spine. Just as she began to record, a loud crash echoed from upstairs, followed by what sounded like footsteps. Jenna's heart raced. Was someone else in the manor? Or was it just her imagination? Gathering her courage, she decided to investigate. She climbed the staircase, the wood creaking beneath her feet. The whispers grew louder, swirling around her like a haunting melody. As she reached the landing, she noticed a door at the end of the hallway slightly ajar, a flickering light spilling out into the darkness. Pushing the door open, she was met with a chilling sight. The room was filled with dusty old furniture and a large, ornate mirror that dominated one wall. But it wasn't the furnishings that caught her attention. It was the figure standing in front of the mirror. A woman, dressed in a tattered white gown, stood staring at her reflection. Her hair hung in disheveled strands, and her face was pale and drawn. Jenna felt her heart stop as the woman turned to face her, a look of sorrow etched across her features. "Help me," the woman whispered, her voice echoing with despair. Jenna took a step back, fear gripping her. "Who are you?" she stammered. The woman's eyes were filled with tears as she pointed toward the mirror. "I am trapped. I cannot leave this place." Jenna's instincts screamed for her to run, but something compelled her to stay. "What happened to you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "My name was Eleanor Blackwood," the woman replied, her gaze locked onto Jenna's. "I was the last owner of this manor. My husband. He was consumed by jealousy. In a fit of rage, he took my life, and now my spirit is bound to this place." Jenna's mind raced. The story she had come to uncover was more tragic than she had anticipated. "Is there any way to help you?" Eleanor stepped closer, her figure shimmering like a mirage. "You must uncover the truth. Only then can I be free." Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. Jenna's heart pounded as she fumbled for her flashlight. When she turned it on, Eleanor was gone, but the mirror still glowed faintly, revealing strange, swirling shapes within its depths. Determined to help the spirit, Jenna began her search for answers. She rummaged through the dusty drawers and boxes scattered around the room, finding old letters and photographs that painted a picture of Eleanor's life. The letters spoke of love, betrayal, and madness, detailing her husband's gradual descent into darkness. As Jenna pieced together the fragments of the past, she felt an overwhelming sense of sadness for Eleanor. The whispers grew more urgent, echoing through the manor as if the house itself was pleading for justice. Jenna knew she had to confront the truth, but she also knew the danger it posed. That night, Jenna set up her camera in the drawing room, determined to capture any evidence of the haunting. As she reviewed her notes, a sudden chill swept through the air, and she felt the presence of Eleanor returning. "Thank you for listening," Eleanor whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. "But you must be careful. He still watches." "Who?" Jenna asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The husband. He will not let me go without a fight." Suddenly, the room grew dark again, and Jenna felt an icy hand grasp her shoulder. She spun around, but there was nothing there. Panic set in as the whispers intensified, filling her mind with dread. She could sense a presence looming behind her, malevolent and vengeful. In a flash of courage, Jenna demanded, "What do you want? Leave me alone." The room shook, and the mirror shattered, pieces flying in all directions. Jenna ducked as the glass rained down around her. In the chaos, she caught a glimpse of a shadowy figure lurking in the corner, a tall man with a twisted expression of rage. "You shouldn't have come here," he growled, his voice a low rumble. Jenna bolted for the door, heart pounding in her chest. She had to escape, but as she reached the staircase, the shadowy figure blocked her way, his presence suffocating. "Stop!" he shouted, and the ground beneath her trembled. With nowhere to run, Jenna turned to face him, her fear transforming into defiance. "You can't keep her here. You can't hide the truth." The figure paused, surprise flickering across his face. "What do you know?" he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "I know what you did," Jenna shouted back, anger surging within her. "You murdered her out of jealousy, and she deserves to be free." For a moment, the room fell silent. The air was thick with tension as Jenna stood her ground, staring down the figure that had once been Eleanor's husband. Then, A low, rumbling laugh erupted from him. "You think you can change anything. She is mine, bound to this place by her own weakness." In that instant, Jenna realized that the shadows were not just a reflection of his rage. They were a manifestation of his guilt. He had trapped himself in the same darkness he had forced upon Eleanor. "Eleanor," Jenna cried out, "you have the power to break this curse. You must show him your strength." Suddenly, the mirror reformed, reflecting not just Jenna, but the image of Eleanor standing tall and defiant. Her pale face was now filled with determination, and her spirit radiated a powerful light that pushed back the shadows. "You will not hold me," Eleanor declared, her voice resonating through the room. "I choose my own fate." With those words, the shadowy figure screamed, a sound of pure agony as the light engulfed him. The walls of Blackwood Manor shook, and Jenna felt the energy shift around her. The dark presence began to dissolve, the air growing lighter as the weight of the curse lifted. Eleanor turned to Jenna, a smile breaking through her sadness. "Thank you for believing in me." In an instant, the house began to transform. The crumbling walls mended, and the dust faded away. Light flooded the rooms, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by warmth and tranquility. As Jenna stepped outside, she turned back to see the manor restored to its former glory. The whispers had ceased, replaced by the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind. Eleanor was free, her spirit released from the chains of the past. Jenna knew she had captured something incredible, more than just a story, but a testament to the power of truth and the strength of the human spirit. She turned her camera toward the magnificent structure, ready to document the beauty of Blackwood Manor, now a place of peace rather than fear. With the sun setting behind her, Jenna felt a sense of closure wash over her. She had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, not just for herself, but for Eleanor. The haunting of Blackwood Manor had come to an end, but its story would live on, a reminder of the power of love, forgiveness, and the courage to confront the past. Deep in the mountains, there was a forest no one dared to enter. It wasn't marked on any map, and the locals spoke of it only in hushed whispers. The Silent Forest, they called it. The name came not from the absence of sound, but from the fact that those who entered it never returned to speak of what they found. For years, the forest had remained untouched. But to Ethan, a freelance photographer, the idea of an unexplored place was irresistible. His career was built on capturing the beauty and mystery of nature, and the Silent Forest, with its dark reputation, seemed like the perfect subject for his next project. Ethan wasn't superstitious, and he didn't believe in the old stories. To him, the forest was just another challenge. With his camera packed and supplies ready, he set out early one autumn morning, the sun just beginning to rise over the distant hills. The locals had warned him not to go, but Ethan was determined. The path to the Silent Forest was overgrown, barely visible through the thick brush, but he followed it confidently. As he approached the edge of the forest, a strange stillness settled over the landscape. The usual sounds of nature, the chirping of birds, the rustle of leaves, faded away, leaving only the soft crunch of Ethan's boots on the ground. The trees ahead were tall and ancient, their thick branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out most of the light. Ethan stepped into the forest, his camera in hand, ready to capture its beauty. But as soon as he crossed the threshold, a shiver ran down his spine. The air was different here, heavier, colder. And the silence. It was oppressive. There were no birds, no insects, not even the whisper of the wind through the trees. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Ignoring the unsettling atmosphere, Ethan began to explore. The deeper he ventured, the stranger things became. The trees seemed to grow closer together, their trunks twisted in unnatural shapes. Shadows danced in the corners of his vision, but when he turned to look, there was nothing there. The forest floor was covered in thick moss, making his footsteps almost soundless. Ethan paused to take a photograph of an ancient tree, its bark gnarled and blackened as if it had been scorched by fire. As he adjusted the lens, he thought he heard something. A faint whisper carried on the still air. He froze, listening. Nothing. Shaking off the feeling of unease, he continued on. But the deeper he went, the more the sense of being watched grew. The shadows between the trees seemed to shift and move, and every now and then he thought he saw figures, pale, fleeting shapes just beyond the reach of his flashlight. Hours passed, and Ethan found himself disoriented. The forest had no clear path, and every direction looked the same. He glanced at his watch, realizing with a start that it was nearly dusk. He should have been heading back, but when he turned to retrace his steps, he found that the way out was gone. The trees had closed in around him, forming an impenetrable wall of branches and darkness. Panic began to set in. He tried to stay calm, telling himself that he just needed to find a clearing or a landmark. But the more he searched, the more hopeless it became. The forest was alive with shadows now, twisting and shifting in the dimming light. And the whispering. It had returned, faint but constant, like voices just out of earshot. Ethan quickened his pace, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't alone. He could feel it. Something was following him, watching him from the shadows. He glanced behind him, and for the first time, he saw it. Just for a moment, a figure standing among the trees. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, spindly limbs that stretched unnaturally from its body. Its face was obscured by darkness, but its eyes glowed faintly in the fading light. Ethan stumbled back, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He turned and ran. The forest seemed to twist and warp around him as he fled, the trees bending and shifting to block his path. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, but Ethan couldn't understand the words. All he could think about was getting out, escaping whatever was hunting him. He didn't know how long he ran, but eventually he burst into a small clearing. His legs burned and his lungs ached with every breath. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe he was safe. But then he heard it again, the soft rustle of movement behind him. Slowly, he turned. Standing at the edge of the clearing was the figure. It had followed him, silent and unrelenting. This time, he could see it more clearly. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes glowed with a sickly yellow light. It had no mouth, yet the whispering grew louder as it approached. Ethan backed away, his hands trembling as he fumbled for his camera. He had to document this, had to capture proof of what he was seeing. But as he lifted the camera to his eye, the figure moved, impossibly fast, closing the distance between them in an instant. Everything went black. When Ethan awoke, he was lying on the forest floor. The sun had set, and the forest was bathed in an eerie, pale light from the full moon. His camera was gone, and his body ached as if he had been dragged through the underbrush. He tried to stand, but his legs felt weak, as though they no longer belonged to him. The whispering had stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. Ethan staggered through the trees, desperate to find a way out. The forest seemed endless, the trees stretching on for miles in every direction. But then, in the distance, he saw a light. Hope surged in his chest and he stumbled toward it. The light grew brighter as he approached, until finally he emerged from the trees into a small clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a house, an old, weathered cabin with a single lantern glowing in the window. Ethan approached cautiously, knocking on the door. After a few moments, the door creaked open, revealing an old man standing in the doorway. His eyes were clouded with age, and his voice was raspy when he spoke. "You shouldn't be here," the old man said, his gaze drifting to the forest behind Ethan. "The forest doesn't let people leave." "I need help," Ethan gasped. "I got lost." The old man shook his head slowly. "No one gets lost here by accident. The forest calls to those it wants, and it never lets them go." Ethan's heart sank. "What do you mean?" The old man stepped aside, gesturing for Ethan to enter. "Come inside. There's something you need to see." Ethan hesitated, but the cold dread that gripped him drove him forward. Inside, the cabin was sparse, with only a small table and a few chairs. But on the far wall, a large wooden board was covered in photographs. Dozens of them. Ethan stepped closer, his breath catching in his throat. The photos were of people, men and women, young and old. But what chilled him to the bone was that each face looked familiar. He recognized them from the shadows in the forest, the fleeting figures that had watched him. And then, at the center of the board, he saw it. A photograph of himself, taken just moments before he had entered the forest. His mind raced. How was this possible? He hadn't even taken a photo of himself. He hadn't. "The forest doesn't just take people," the old man said from behind him. "It keeps them." Ethan turned to the old man, his blood running cold. "What are you saying?" The old man sighed, his gaze distant. "You're already part of it now. You can't leave, not anymore." Before Ethan could respond, the door of the cabin creaked open again and the cold air of the forest rushed in. The whispering had returned.